Hey, what's up you guys? It's Tyler from the Harringtons. We are back today with a brand new video, and this video today is going to be for all you photographers out there. This is going to be your complete MacBook buying guide. I get lots of questions. I see tons of conversations on Facebook groups all the time. People asking, which computer should I buy? How much RAM do I need? All these different things. I also see a lot of people who are a little bit confused, perhaps, about what the different components of the computer do, what's important, what's not, all these different things. So in this video today, I'm going to clear up all of those things. Any questions you could ever have about what computer you should buy, I'm going to answer in this video right now. Alright, so this is how this video is going to go. I'm actually going to leave timestamps down below of all the different sections of this video. So if you're out there and you don't care about what all the different parts of the computer do, you just want my recommendations, you can go straight to that part, whatever you want. So here's what we're going to do. First, we're going to kind of go through all the different components of the computer that you need to worry about as a photographer. What each thing does, how it's actually going to impact your day-to-day life as a photographer, and just give you a little bit of general knowledge if you're interested in that sort of thing so that you can make an educated decision on buying a computer in the future. Then we're going to jump in. I'm going to show you some recommendations for pre-built computers, like just ones you can go to the store and buy right away, and a couple of different price point options, what I think that you should invest your money in if you have a certain budget. So let's just jump right into it. All right, so we're going to break down all the different components of the computer that you need to worry about as a buyer and how they actually impact you. So let's start with RAM. RAM technically stands for Random Access Memory, and it is the physical hardware inside a computer that temporarily stores data, serving as the computer's working memory. Additional RAM allows the computer to work with more information at the same time, which usually has a considerable effect on total system performance. Okay, so that's the technical definition. What does that mean for you? Essentially what RAM does is it allows you to do multitasking. Every single time you open a program, it needs to store some temporary memory files and it has to put it somewhere. And where it stores it is going to be in your RAM. So the more RAM that you have, the more programs you can have open, the more operations you can have going on at the same time. The best way this has ever been explained to me was one time in an Apple store, the guy explained it to me as, think of your RAM as the size of your desk, right? So if you're organizing a bunch of stacks of paper and things like that, the bigger desk that you have, right, the more room you have to create different types of stacks and to move things around. The smaller desk you have, things are going to start getting cluttered. You're going to have to start stacking and unstacking and restacking things. It's going to slow you down. So the more RAM you have, you can think of it as being the size of your desk, the more memory that you have. One really thing to know about RAM though is that the more RAM that you have doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have a faster experience, right? Your computer only needs as much RAM as it actually needs. So if your computer only needs, say, 11 gigs of RAM is kind of the most your computer ever maxes out at, if you have 32, 64, 124 gigs of RAM, it's not going to make any difference, right? As long as you have enough RAM to cover your needs of your computer, then you're going to be good to go. So what do I recommend in terms of RAM for a photographer? Well, Adobe recommends that you have a minimum of, they technically say you can run it on 4 gigs of RAM for Lightroom, but they also say that 12 is recommended. So I would say that if you have 8 gigs of RAM, you can get away with it, but you're going to see considerable slowdowns. You're going to see bogging down of your computer, especially when you're using Lightroom. And if you have any more than one program open at any time, you're definitely going to see some slowdowns with RAM, with 8 gigs of RAM, but you can make that work. I think 16 gigs is going to be the sweet spot in terms of price to performance. With 16 gigs of RAM, most of the time you're going to be okay. If you're the kind of person that runs a lot of different programs, if you have Lightroom and Photoshop and a bunch of Chrome tabs open at the same time, 16 gigs you might start to cap out towards that, but you should be okay for the most part. And then 32 gigs of RAM is pretty much what I'd consider the safest bet. It's going to be more expensive to upgrade to 32 gigs of RAM, and Apple only actually recently allowed the MacBook Pros to even have 32 gigs of RAM as an option, and it's only available in the 15-inch models, which we'll get into later. But 32 gigs of RAM is pretty much guaranteed safe. I don't think you ever are going to need more than that, and if you know that you do a lot of multitasking and you want the guaranteed best case scenario, you're never going to run out of RAM, 32 gigs is going to be the best bet. But I think that for most people out there, 16 will be fine. So you might be wondering, okay, so what if I only get 8 gigs of RAM and my computer needs more than that? Then what's going to happen? Well, what ends up happening is your computer's smart. It's going to end up using a portion of your hard drive to store all those random data pieces of data just temporarily. And the reason why this becomes a problem is because the RAM speeds, the read and write speeds of your RAM, is significantly faster than the read and write speeds of your hard drive. So while yes, your computer won't shut down and you will be able to continue working, wherever it's pulling data or storing those temporary files on your hard drive, you're gonna see a huge difference in performance. So yes, if you only have 8 or 16 gigs and your computer needs more than that, it'll still function all right. And in those rare circumstances, you'll probably be able to get away with it, but it's not gonna be nearly as smooth of a experience as if you have enough RAM to cover your needs. All right, so there's RAM. The next thing we need to cover is gonna be our CPU. So the CPU is a central processing unit, and it is the electronic circuitry within a computer that carries out the instructions of a computer program by performing the basic arithmetic, logic, controlling, and input and output operations specified by the instructions. Pretty much you can think of this as the brain of your computer. And the faster your CPU is, the faster your computer is gonna run just overall. Now, where you're gonna see biggest improvements on this as a photographer, or where the CPU is gonna come into the most, is gonna be pretty much with everything. So a good CPU is actually really important, but the faster the CPU, you're gonna see faster, your computer will turn on faster, programs will open faster, and then whenever you're in Lightroom itself and you're editing photos, the computer is using the CPU and the GPU both a lot when just doing normal editing, but the biggest difference you're gonna see in terms of performance differences is gonna be anytime you're importing photos and anytime you're exporting photos. Both of those are very CPU heavy tasks. So if you have a slower CPU, it's gonna take significantly longer whenever you're exporting photos and importing photos, and vice versa. If you have a much faster CPU, you'll see much faster export times with your photos. So you'll be waiting around less for those photos to export. Okay, so when it comes to CPU, it's measured in kind of two different ways. The speed is measured in gigahertz, GHz, and basically the bigger the number, the faster that it's gonna be moving. So 3.2 gigahertz is gonna be slower than 3.8 gigahertz, etc. The other thing you wanna look for when you're looking at a CPU is gonna be the number of cores. So for Lightroom and any of these editing programs, the more cores you have, the better. And essentially what a core is, it's what's doing the actual operation. So if you have 4 cores, you've got 4 little mini brains in there that are working together, versus you have 8 cores, you have 8 ones that are working together to kind of spread that load out. So more cores is better. Now this can get a little bit tricky because sometimes what you'll see is you'll see a faster speed, so a higher gigahertz, but you'll see less cores. So it's actually better to have more cores that might be a little bit slower than it is to have less cores that are a little bit faster. Now, unlike with the RAM, the faster your CPU, the better, the more cores, the faster it is, the better overall performance you're just gonna get across the board. So there really is no limit, like the more cores you have, the better it's going to be, the faster, all that sort of stuff. So this is one of those areas where if you're gonna spend your money, this is an area where you're really gonna see more performance the more money that you put into it, and vice versa. The cheaper you go and the slower you have, the overall, you're gonna feel that a lot more in your sort of day-to-day tasks. All right, so next up we need to talk about the GPU. The GPU is the graphics processing unit, and it is a programmable logic chip specialized for display functions. The GPU renders images, animations, and video for the computer's screen. Now, this is where it gets a little bit tricky because yes, GPUs are important and they're important in certain areas, but for some reason, a lot of Adobe programs don't utilize the GPU all that much. So it's important, yes, but it's not the most important factor that I would look at. So from everything I've seen in Lightroom, it does use the GPU, but you don't necessarily have to have the best GPU in the world for it to work smoothly. Again, your RAM and your CPU are gonna have more of an impact on your overall performance than your GPU is, especially when you're in something like Lightroom. The only time this is not really true is if you're doing any of the newish Lightroom features that use a lot of AI and like graphical background information and things like that, where that might see a big difference, but overall the GPU isn't that big of a deal. So the only other scenario where you'd want to actually pay attention to a GPU, whether your computer has one or not or how fast it is going to be if you use an external monitor. So if you have a 4K monitor or like a high resolution monitor that you plan to be using, then the GPU actually will help a lot with that when it comes to pushing those pixels, and that's pretty much what the GPU is for. It's for those monitors and things like that. So if you plan on using 4K monitor, you may want to be more aware of the GPU that you have in your computer. All right, and the last thing we need to talk about is going to be the hard drive. So all Apple laptops these days come with a solid state hard drive. Basically, this means that there's no spinning disk. It's a very fast drive. It's a similar type of drive that you'd find in something like your phone. It's basically considered flash storage, all these different things, but there's no moving parts and it's very, very fast. And Apple is notorious for actually having very good SSDs that they put in all of their computers. However, they do rake you over the coals in terms of how much they charge for space upgrade. So what I would say when it comes to Apple is, if you're a photographer out there, you don't want to be storing any of your RAW files or anything really on your internal SSD of your computer. The only thing you should be putting on there is going to be your program files for things like Lightroom and Photoshop, etc., and any of your other programs, and then any of your sort of system files. If you can keep that internal hard drive as clean as possible, you're going to get the best overall experience and the best performance. However, I will say that no matter what, I would say at a minimum you want a 256 gigabyte hard drive as the bare minimum. They do have ones that are smaller than that, I think 120 or 125 gigabytes, but I just have found that no matter what, even just, again, loading up all the Adobe programs and kind of all just the normal stuff, that's going to get close to full if you're not really careful, and Apple actually recommends that you always have at least 25% of your hard drive free at all times for optimal performance. So I just think that anything less than the 256 is going to be really pushing that cap, and you're going to start to see maybe some slowdowns and start to fill it up and things like that. So 256 is a minimum, I would say, for the hard drive, unless you're on a really, really, really tight budget. Okay, so those are all the different components you need to know about. So hopefully just knowing kind of what those do and how they're going to impact you as a photographer will be helpful as you're sort of making these different choices. Again, I don't know your exact budget or exactly what you're going to be needing in your computer, but hopefully having this knowledge of what all these different components do will help you to decide how to best spend your dollars. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go kind of through all the different computers that Apple offers. I'm going to talk about some of the pros and cons of each, because I also see a lot of confusion around this. The next thing is going to be the MacBook Air. Now, there's a lot of confusion around this MacBook Air, so I kind of want to spend a little bit of time on this. So in 2010, Apple came out with the MacBook Air, and at the time, it was a revolutionary computer. It was the thinnest laptop with great performance and great battery life and all these things, and it was the workhorse computer that was one of the most popular computers of all time, right? And there gets a lot of confusion because it was so popular and recommended for such a long time that the MacBook Air is still a really great option. Now, it literally took them almost 9 years to re-update this computer, but last year they came out with a new version of the MacBook Air, which is okay, but the problem really is, again, when it came out, the selling point of the MacBook Air was that it was so thin and so light. But however, at this point now, the MacBook Pro and the MacBook Air are very, very similar in size and weight and all those different things, that there's not a huge difference like there used to be. So I would say that if you're a photographer out there, there's really no reason to go with the MacBook Air. It's only $100 cheaper than some of the MacBook Pros that you can get, and there's really no advantages to going with the Air. So I would say, just as a general rule of thumb, I would avoid the Air. I would stick only with the MacBook Pro line of computers. Now, this gets into another thing that's interesting to notice is there are 13-inch MacBook Pros and 15-inch MacBook Pros. Now, aside from the screen difference, the main difference between these is going to be that on the 13-inch computers, you have a cap on how much RAM you can put. The most you can put is 16 gigabytes of RAM. There's going to be generally slower processors. You can't put as fast of a processor in any of the 13-inch computers, even if you wanted to. And it only has an integrated graphics card. So we talked about GPUs earlier, and basically the integrated graphics card means that the GPU and the CPU kind of all work together on one chipset, and there's not a dedicated standalone GPU in any of these machines. So the 13-inch MacBook Pros are going to just be generally underpowered or less powerful than the 15-inch counterparts. So yes, the screen size is going to be smaller, and that could be a pro or a con for you depending on how you look at it, but the biggest difference is going to be just power options. With the 15-inch MacBook Pros, you can go up to 32 gigs of RAM. You have faster CPU options just kind of right out of the box, and you obviously have a bigger screen, and you get that dedicated GPU. So even the baseline 15-inch MacBook Pro, the cheapest one that you can get, is going to be significantly faster for all those different reasons than probably the most decked out 13-inch MacBook Pro that you can get. So we're going to get into the computer in a minute and kind of look at some of these side-by-side comparisons, but it's really important to know those two differences between the 13 and the 15-inch. It's beyond just the screen size. And then the last thing to talk about is going to be the iMacs and the new Mac Pro that's coming out. So the Mac Pro, I would say, is going to be overkill for anybody who's doing photography. It's close to $10,000 machine. Just, you don't need it. It's cool to look at. It's great that Apple's doing that, but you don't need that. The iMacs are actually a really great option. So if you're looking at these MacBook Pro prices and you're looking at, and you hear what I said about, the minimum amount of RAM you need and all the different things, you're like, I want a faster processor, I want all these different things, but the price tag from the MacBook Pros is kind of scaring you, the iMac might be a good option. So basically with the iMac, you can get a lot more power for a lot less money because you're not paying for the portability of the laptop. You can actually get a really fast iMac for a lot less money. So if you don't necessarily need the power on the go, the iMac might be a really great option for you to look into. And all of the same things I mentioned in terms of GPU, CPU, RAM, all those things apply the same to the iMac. The only difference is you get a really gorgeous 5K display built in, which is a really nice feature, and you don't get the portability. So if the MacBook Pro prices are just not what you need, but you want that power, check out the iMac. All right, so there's a pretty good overview. So you have all kind of the background information and knowledge about what all these different things do, why they're important, why they're not important, etc. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna jump into the computer, and I'm actually gonna go on Apple's website and we're gonna look at some of the pre-built computers that I suggest. If you wanna just pick one up off the shelves with no customization, which ones I suggest, and if you have a specific budget, which upgrades I would choose, where I would try and land if you have a specific budget. So let's jump into the computer and we'll check out apple.com. All right, here we are on the computer. We are on apple.com, and let's just go through some of the pre-built options they have, and then we'll go through some custom upgrades I think would be worth it if you have some extra budget. So basically, these are nice because you could walk into any Apple store, you can go to any Best Buy, and you can pick up one of these laptops right here. You can buy them that day, there's no waiting, etc. If you do want to get a custom one where you can choose some upgrades and things like that, you are going to have to wait, so you have to think in advance for some of those things, but you can pick some of the components that you want to be upgraded, etc. So if you're looking at a pre-built 13-inch MacBook Pro, I would suggest getting this one right here. You're going to get a 2.4 gigahertz quad-core processor, right, which is going to be a big speed improvement from the 1.4 gigahertz quad-core processor you get with this cheaper one right here. It's going to give you the 256 gigabytes of storage like I mentioned, and the only downside is that you're only going to have 8 gigabytes of RAM, and unfortunately all of the 13-inch MacBook Pros that are pre-built only come with 8 gigabytes of RAM. So if you do want 16 gigs of RAM, you're going to have to choose an upgraded option. But if you want to just pick one up from the store, this is the one that I would suggest. Over on the 15-inch side, I would suggest going with this base model right here. For $23.99, this is you get 2.6 gigahertz, but it's a 6-core processor, which is great. It's a 256 gigabyte hard drive, which is going to be enough, and we get 16 gigabytes of RAM. So this is a really great option right here. So I would say just like straight up, if you want a really great price for a lot of performance and you want a computer that you know is just going to work, this is the one I'd go with right here. $23.99 is not cheap by any means, but I think that this is going to be sort of that sweet spot for the dedicated graphics, 16 gigs of RAM, enough of a hard drive, a fast enough processor. This is going to kind of be the sweet spot right here. Okay, but let's say that you have a $1,500 budget, right? What can we get with $1,500 budget? So if I was you, what I would do is actually I would go with this base model right here, the cheapest one, the $12.99. And if we select that, it's going to give us our options for upgrading. So we can upgrade the processor, but that's going to be $300. That's going to push us over our budget. So I would stay away from that. What I would actually do is I would actually jump over here and I would actually jump up to the 16 gigabytes of RAM. I think that that's going to be the biggest difference in terms of just like overall use and using Lightroom. That's going to give you the most bang for your buck. Especially, so it's right there, that puts us right at $14.99. So it's going to be 128 gig SSD, which isn't ideal, but again, I think you can get away with that. The difference between a 1.4 gigahertz quad core and a 1.7 gigahertz quad core honestly isn't going to be that big of a difference. I don't think that you're going to feel that as much as you're going to feel the jump from 8 to 16 gigs of RAM. So this is what I would do. If you have a $1,500 budget, I would go with this bottom, the cheapest MacBook Pro they have, the 13-inch, and I would bump up to 16 gigs of RAM. So now let's say you have a $2,000 budget. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky because A $2,000 budget for a MacBook Pro is sort of in a dead zone in terms of price to performance and all those different things. What I would probably tell you, honestly, would be to save some extra money and go get the 15-inch. I would save an extra $400 and just buy this base 15-inch right here. But if you really want to buy something and you only have $2,000, what I would probably have to direct you towards would be this 13-inch MacBook Pro right here, the one with the 2.4 gigahertz processor. And then again, same thing, we're going to upgrade our RAM to 16 gigs, and that's going to cap us out right at our $2,000 budget. So we are going to get a 256 gig SSD, which is a good amount. We're going to have that 16 gigs of RAM, which I think is going to be great. And we are going to have that faster 2.4 gigahertz quad core processor. So basically for $500, the difference between this computer and the $1,500 one is you're going to get a little bit more memory in your SSD, and you are going to get a slightly faster processor. Now, it's still only quad core. It's still only 2.4 gigahertz, so it's not, a huge jump in improvement. But for $500, that's a pretty good upgrade between those two different things. All right, and then next, if we have a $2,500 budget, so this is a really weird spot. So this is already basically $2,400. So this is pretty much the computer I would suggest if you have a $2,500 budget. But let's say you have a little bit more maybe, and you want to say, what's going to be worth it for my upgrade, Ty? All right, so here are our options. Let's kind of talk through some of our options when we get into the 15 inches. So we can jump up to a 2.4 gigahertz 8-core 9th generation processor. Okay, so this is a $300 increase. And yes, this 2.4 is slower than this, but you're getting 2 additional cores. So this is actually going to be significantly faster. Now, however, I will say, I think that this processor right here is going to give you more than enough performance for running Lightroom. I don't think that this is going to be a necessary upgrade. Again, when it comes to memory, we talked about this earlier. The jump from 16 to 32 is really just going to be for your safety, right? If you really want to never ever have to worry about it, you want to be able to run as many programs as possible and never have to think about it. Yes, this jump to 32 gigs of RAM is going to be worth it. It's $400. It's kind of expensive, but I think that if you are the kind of person that runs a lot of different stuff and you want to have no worries, never have to think about it, this is going to be worth it for you. Graphics card, I would leave it as is. It's not going to be worth it to jump up to the 560 versus the 555. Again, we talked about that. The GPU is not super important for photo editing. And then lastly, if you want to double your storage for only $200, that's a pretty good deal. I think you can get away with 256, but if you really wanted to, you could jump up to here. Anything higher than that, I think, is going to be unnecessary. Again, you shouldn't be storing anything on here, any of your raw files or anything like that. So I really don't think you're going to need more than 512. A 1 terabyte is nice to have if you've got some extra money laying around. But I think that this right here with the 32 gigs of RAM, this processor for $29.99 is going to be a really, really good spot for most people. So if you can get to that $3,000 point in your budget, whether that means you have to save up or do whatever, I think that this is going to be a really, really, really powerful, smooth machine you're not going to have to worry about, that's going to give you really great performance for years to come. And then lastly, just for kicks and giggles, if you wanted to get the best MacBook Pro that you could possibly buy and money was not an option, we would take the $27.99 one. We're going to trick this daddy out. We're going to jump up to the 2.4 gigahertz 8-core i9 processor. We're going to go with 32 gigs of RAM. We're going to jump up to the Radeon Vega Pro 20 with 4 gigabytes of HBM2 memory. This is just a faster graphics card. We are going to go to a 1 terabyte SSD. Anything higher than that, I think, is unnecessary. But we're looking at a $3,949 price tag for this puppy. But you will know that you have one of the fastest MacBook Pros that you can buy. All right, there you guys have it. Hopefully this video was helpful to you and hopefully it clears some things up. I know that buying a new computer is a really big decision, and if you're not a super techie person out there, it can be really intimidating to purchase a computer, spend all this money, and not really know what you're getting. So hopefully this video was able to shed some light on what is actually important, what's not important, and what you're actually buying when you go to spend all that money. And hopefully you can make a really well-educated buying decision going forward. If you had any additional questions I didn't cover in this video, I'd love to answer those for you down in the comments down below. And I would love to hear from you if you decide to buy a computer with these tips. I'd love to hear how it went, what you went with, and if you learned anything from this video that you may not have known otherwise. Aside from that, thank you guys so much for watching. This has been Tyler from the Harringtons, and I will see you in the next one.